This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What in the hell's going on?
What the hell is going on?
What the hell is going on?
I don't know what the hell he's talking about.
You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
What the hell's the matter with these guys?
We don't know what's going on.
What the hell's going on?
Who in God's name knows what it's all about?
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka.
And I'm Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast, What the Hell is Going On? Mark, what the hell this week?
What the hell is we're continuing our summer reading series and our summer book series, and we're having a different conversation because we're talking with an author of a book who wrote a book about reading aloud and also had a wonderful op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, an essay in the Wall Street Journal weekend about books to read aloud or to read on your audiobooks to read on your summer travels. And so we just get into an interesting discussion about reading aloud, listening to audiobooks, reading to your children, and the value of it. What do you think, Danny?
Our mutual, very dear friend, Beth, says to us all the time, says to me all the time, I love listening to your podcast because I feel like I'm sitting there in the living room with the two of you and it's just like old times. And I think for our listeners today, it's going to be a little bit like sitting in a coffee shop with you and me and our wonderful guest, Meghan Gurdon, and talking about books we love. I don't know whether our listeners will share the same experience, but when you start talking about books you love and authors you love, it's a rabbit hole, and you just go from book to book to book, and that's what we did.
It's fun because everybody has different tastes and different books they've read, and the best way to find a good book is to hear about a friend who read one and recommended it to you. Meghan wrote this great book about reading to your children and the value of reading to your children and how important it is, how well students do their studies that show that children who have extended attention in this short attention span era, it takes sustained attention to sit down and share a story together, and how much better they do when they're 21-year-olds in math and English when they were read to as young children. And also just the opportunity to share time together and to talk about things. Because you don't just, when you read with your children, you don't just read to them, you then talk about the book and you have conversations, and you're not sitting there. We got so many these days, everybody's on their screens, and and they're sitting around. You can all be together and not be together at all, right, in a room. But if you're reading a book together out loud, you are together in a truly profound sense. And so
a shared world that your book creates.
Exactly.
Every single one of my kids can still recite, cow says moo, a sheep says ba, three singing pigs say la la la.
So when I was in the Bush administration, I went to Australia with President Bush. And in the gift shop in Parliament in Canberra, I bought a book, and I think I brought one back for you, for your girls. And I bought one called Wombat Stew. And it was about this wombat who escapes being eaten. And I read it to them with an Australian accent. And to this day, all my kids who are 18, 20, 21 will say, Wombat Stew, ooey, gooey, chewy, Wombat Stew. which was the refrain in the book. So, you imprint things on their minds when they're very young that stay forever. And you have rare opportunities to do that. So reading is great for kids, and it's even better for adults.
Well, that's for sure. And Meghan really gets that. Meghan Cox-Gurdon is the weekly columnist for the book pages of the Wall Street Journal, and she covers children's literature, wombats, as well as moo ba la la la, as well as a range of titles for adults. She's a former foreign correspondent, and she has 5 children, so she knows whereof she speaks, with the lovely, also journalist Hugo Gurdon. She is the author of the book we're talking about today, The Enchanted Hour, The Miraculous Power of Reading Aloud in the Age of Distraction.
Here's our conversation. Meghan, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me.
We're so thrilled to have you. So we asked you because you had this wonderful essay in the Wall Street Journal and the Saturday edition, which is, by the way, is one of my guilty pleasures. Every Saturday is opening up the Wall Street Journal and reading. And I came across your wonderful essay about the best audiobooks for summer road trips. And you've written a book about reading aloud to your children. You had some great ideas about books that people should read. But let's talk first about this new phenomenon that has really taken off, which is that you can read with your ears for the first time without actually even having to have a parent reading to you. You can be a grown-up and be read to today. Talk to us about that and why that's such a wonderful phenomenon.
I mean, obviously, the talking book, as it used to be called, has been with us for most of the last century. In fact, it was after, I think, maybe the First World War that you had the first recorded books on discs and that kind of thing. But audiobooks, sort of as we experience them now, have no opprobrium attached to them. There is no shame about listening to an audiobook. And there was, within living memory, people would feel a little embarrassed if they listened
Not really
to
reading.
Yeah, I didn't really read it. And actually, one of the things I learned in researching my book, The Enchanted Hour, was how untrue that is. Actually, when you read with your ears, you have a different experience, but you're getting all the language. In some respects, you may be getting more of the language as an adult if you're listening to something that is written in a style that might seem somewhat antiquated or arcane or esoteric compared to the sort of popular writing today. Let's say you're listening to a classic book of a century or more ago. What might be very tangled up language if you were reading by eye, because we are accustomed now to reading things that are more streamlined, unfurls perfectly by ear. So we have two things going on here. One is that audiobooks they needn't be a guilty pleasure because there need be no guilt whatever associated with them. So there's that, which is lovely. They create an accessibility to literature that way. And they also create accessibility because someone is reading the story to you. So you are, as it were, in a mechanistic way, you are reading with your ears, you're hearing the words, you're creating the word images in your mind, what the radio people used to call the theater of the mind, when you listen to a story and you imagine it. And all of that is happening thanks to this miracle of someone else having taken the trouble to read to you. So it's great if you have someone in your home who can sit down with you in the evening, pour you a glass of wine and read to you. That's lovely. It's great if you have children at home and you can cuddle up with them after their bath and read to them and fill their minds with language. And it's also great because you can just pop on the old Audible or whatever system you use and going about the humdrum works of daily life, like whatever it is, making beds or mowing the lawn, or maybe you can't listen then, but you can have access to literature as a kind of backdrop of your life. I mean, how great is that?
It's wonderful. I'll give you mentioned the theater of the mind. You always would hear people say, like, well, I read the book, so I don't want to see the movie because I don't want it to ruin the image I have. I'll give you a recent example of that for me is I absolutely fell in love with Amor Towles. And I read Gentleman in Moscow, and then I read all of Lincoln Highway. I literally listened to every word that Amor Towles has written after that book. And then they came out with this new Netflix series, and I have not been able to bring myself to watch it because I'm afraid it's going to ruin it for me. Is it?
Is it really? I'm afraid to watch it too.
I'm afraid to watch it. I don't want it to ruin
I can tell both of you. So I loved his first book.
The Rules of Civility?
Yes.
Thank you. The Rules of Civility. But I liked, I think, even more A Gentleman in Moscow. It was the most beautifully evocative. I liked a little bit less The Lincoln Highway, and I've got his book of short stories sitting here ready to read by the pool when I go on holiday. But finally, a friend persuaded me to watch it on Netflix. And it's got the Bridgerton thing where you have people of different races who are anomalous to the scene in the show. And it really bothered me because, of course, the communists were hugely racist. The Russians in general, but the communists were hugely racist. The notion that there were black people who were important members of the Communist Party is laughable. The notion that there were senior members of the U.S. Embassy who were black is even more laughable in that period. And yet these characters in the show are black. And I will say this, after 3 or 4 episodes, it didn't matter anymore. The story was still very nice and very watchable, and I recommend it. So there you go.
Well, that's reassuring. I would say A Gentleman in Moscow is an excellent example of a book. Well, Look, I have to confess, I've only read it by ear. I haven't read it by eye. But it seemed to me, as it was unfurling, to be the sort of book that was perfectly suited to audio. Because if your eye jumped ahead, you would spoil things for yourself, and you just can't do it, right? When you're listening to audio.
Oh,
I
that's
mean, I
really
suppose this is
interesting.
also true with film, in that what is given to you is doled out by the filmmaker. But when you're listening to literature read out loud, you're getting it one word at a time. There can be no rushing forward. I mean, people can listen at very accelerated speeds, and some people are, especially blind people, are habituated to doing that, those who consume a lot by ear. But you get, as it were, the full pleasure and weight of every word, and therefore the full pleasure and weight of every turn of the story. And I think that was a great example of that working well.
That's absolutely fascinating to me. So I have the opposite problem. So first of all, I have to confess that, as I told Mark before we started the podcast, it is Mark who introduced me to audiobooks, not because I'd never heard of them, but because I'd never been persuaded, probably because of the prejudices that you both outlined at the beginning. It's not really reading when you're listening, that I had not done that. So I finally bit the bullet. And the first book that I listened to was Matt Continetti, our colleague's book called The Right, which was just wonderful. And I really
Epic.
enjoyed it. But see, I have the exact opposite approach from the two of you. When I'm reading a serious book, my attention span tends to wander because I can go and look at something else. Whereas if I'm reading a page turner, mystery, I have no problem. I'll never put it down because I'm really engrossed and enjoy it. And that's why, for me, I can't cheat if it's nonfiction, where I'm just going to put it down again and again and again. So I love listening to nonfiction, and I don't really like listening to fiction. It's funny. I mean, how do you feel about it? Do you have a one side or the other, Meghan?
I have listened to nonfiction. Actually, it's a while ago now. The only book that really springs to mind is Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder, which was very well constructed as a book. But the problem that I had with it, and now it describes essentially the depopulation of the areas between those areas controlled by Hitler and Stalin. He had, just the mass killing of vast numbers of people through famine and gas and bullets and such in the early years of the Titanic conflict in the middle of last century. But the problem I had with it with nonfiction is that in a book of that sort, there are a great many numbers. And when you're listening, you don't know what the number is going to be. So someone can say, it was 100,000 million. And you're like, wait, what? How many? I don't have a good mind for visualizing numbers, perhaps. Whereas if I saw that written down, I could instantly see we're looking at a vast number here. Whereas when it's just said out loud, I follow a little slowly, maybe. So for me, fiction is really the thing. I love it for fiction.
So I have one more procedural question before we get into substance. And it's funny because I like listening to The Right so much, I downloaded a whole bunch more books. And one thing distinguishes them. So it's important to understand, Mark loves to make fun of me. And Meghan, you will understand this because your husband is English. But I learned to read and write in England. And so the voice in my head that reads is English. And when I
that's so
listen to
funny.
a book being read by an American, I find it very difficult and I don't enjoy it.
I totally agree, although there are some magnificent American readers. But there is definitely something in the theatrical training, something in the literary culture in England, I think. I think your prejudice or your bias there is entirely justified because I share it, and therefore 2/3 of us here, so it's a majority really. Who think this. Uh, But no, I think that's right. I mean, I do think that the voice of the reader can be decisive. So my project this summer, my reading project, is I have been reading, I've actually just finished, the 12-novel series by Anthony Pohl called A Dance to the Music of Time. My husband and I were both reading it, and I read it years ago. I've remembered almost nothing of it. And I tried to listen to the audio version, which is read by Simon Vance, who's a name you might remember. He's English and he reads a lot. You can find a lot of his books. And for some reason, he just messed it up so much. It was infuriating. I couldn't listen. So I was forced to go back to my eyes for these 12 novels. And I'm also, just at the moment, I never read any Victor Hugo, and I thought, okay, well, I kind of read some Victor Hugo. So I'm listening to The Hunchback of Notre Dame. And I have to say, I don't love the reader. I do not love the reader, whose name I will be unable to tell you, so I won't introduce him here, but apart from saying that. But the story is so good, I can't quite make myself give up. Like, it's really lurid and exciting and melodramatic. And there's a lot of sort of sly commentary about architecture and, interesting sort of subtopics for the educated listener.
I'll bet you that eventually, as AI gets better, and this is probably bad for the audiobook actors out there, but it'll be so realistic. You'll be able to choose an English voice, or like just like you can with your directions in the car, or yeah, you'll be able to choose a man or a woman, and you'll be able to test the voices and the accent and everything, and you can even listen to them in Australian, Danny, if you wanted to.
Hey,
So I bet you
excuse me,
that's coming down the road.
my Google is Australian.
Yes, there you go. But here's another thing that I found about audiobooks. I have undiagnosed dyslexia. It always took me a long time to read books. And so having audiobooks opened the world of reading to me that I always loved reading, but it was always a challenge for me. And having somebody read them to me was liberating. But it also allows you to take on a book that would be a lot of work, and you weren't sure if you wanted to read it, but it would be a lot of work to sit down because it's very long or difficult or something you might want to try but not care. And you can sort of not pay attention the whole time, and you don't care necessarily if you miss parts of it. It allows a casual reading as well as an intense reading, don't you think?
I absolutely do. And actually, one of the things I talked about in my book is what a liberation reading aloud does when we bring it to children. I don't want to be too lectury about it, but really, it is really. Also, Mark, how old were you when you were liberated by audiobooks?
They've really taken off in the last decade. So it's probably in the last decade. I mean, my reading, if you did a chart of my reading, it was obviously required reading in high school, required reading in college. And then when I left college, it sort of dropped off a lot. And then audiobooks, it's taken off like a thunderbolt since then.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, I think that a lot of the pedagogy around reading is very painful for children who are not naturally good at it, or for the dyslexic, or children who aren't super quick on the draw. Or could be all kinds of reasons, or children whose parents didn't read to them or talk to them much, and therefore their vocabulary is kind of lagging. And so reading as experienced by young people can be a form of suffering and torture. And what a terrible thing that is, when really, as you have discovered thanks to audiobooks, as some people are lucky to get through other mechanisms, reading is a pleasure. It's a delight. It opens the world to you. It opens all of language to you. It opens history. Really, there's nothing it doesn't really open to you. And it is a great gift, I think, to give to the people in our lives, and not just children and not just ourselves, but there are people who may be unable to read for themselves for whatever reason. Maybe they have macular degeneration or something, and older people, let's say, we can read to the older people in our lives, or we can facilitate their renting of audiobooks, whatever. I had a really lovely experience when my mother was dying a couple of years ago. I read Kipling's Just So stories to her.
Oh, wow.
And she was tremendously moved by that, because actually there was this extraordinary little sort of braiding through time that went on. Because she had read the Justice stories to me, and I had read them to my children. Now I was reading them to my mother, and the first time she'd heard them was when her mother was reading them to her. So it was like this Mobius strip with all of these generations of our family, and Kipling somehow winding through. It really felt like something real, and she just absolutely loved it. I also read her The Wind in the Willows, which she laughed and laughed and laughed, and it was very dear. And at that point, actually, she had a condition that made it impossible for her to read anymore. So it's a kind of liberation at all stages of life.
I have one child who is diagnosed with dyslexia, and she actually uses both at the same time. So she will read, she has the physical copy of the book so she can take notes in it, but listens to the audiobook as she's reading because it helps her focus and pay attention and not get lost. Lots of ways to do it.
That's such a good idea. It's an excellent idea.
It is multidimensional. It's funny, Meghan, you reminded me of one of my favorite stories that I've told to a bunch of people, and I know Mark has heard it, but the way that books wind their way through your life and create a connection, which is sometimes really hard to make. So, my father, who is dead, but grew up in Europe and was born in Austria. And so when he was a little boy, he read the book that all German and Austrian little boys used to read, which is by Karl May. And Karl May was only translated, they only translated 6 books of his into English. And so my father got those for me when I was a girl, and they're now out of print, but I read them as well. So as a result, and I would come home late at night, and my father would have the books kind of lying next to his bed. You know how sometimes you turn to books that you read when you were younger. But the great part of this is not me reading these stories, and I used to read it to my father in German, sometimes not understanding all of it. But the great part of this story is that, so my father would read Karl May, and I mean everybody of that generation, the 30s and 40s. Hitler read Karl May. Everybody read it. And Karl May only wrote about 2 things. He wrote about cowboys and Indians, and he wrote about the Middle East. And I think Mark knows the story. Anyway, I'm talking to Henry Kissinger, obviously, long before he died, and we start talking about Karl May. And he said, well, of course, I read those books too. Of course, I was a little boy in Germany. I read them as well. And he goes, everybody always asks me why I fell in love with America. And I always say, well, I read about Roosevelt and I read about everything he ever did. And I thought he was such a hero. He said, and I always said that. He said, but now I realize, and this was probably 5-6 years ago, he said, now I realize that was a lie. He said, actually, I loved America because of Karl May. And I was like, oh my God. And this is what books do for you. And now, you're right. And they create that thread for you, like you with your mother, and all of these stories. They're really, it's incredible.
Yeah, I think in a way we almost have a duty to pass on what we loved to others. If we don't, you get that generational connection. I mean, it's, here we are. I never thought I would be sort of wistful for the 20th century, but, the 21st century is making the 20th century look not so bad as certainly portions of it. And there's a whole sensibility that people who come from that century had, or people who came from earlier in that century. Associations, ideas of what it is to live a good life, all sorts of things, lines of poetry. It's a shame if that thread gets broken, and it's lovely when it can be, extended to the next generation or those following by sharing the things that we knew and loved, or that we got from our grandparents, or that they got from their grandparents. It's just a beautiful act of kind of cultural conservation, I think.
One of the things you've written is how for children, this is the antidote to screens. That screens have reduced our attention span of this generation. And reading, either by listening or by reading, requires sustained attention. It's both an exercise in sustained attention, but it's also a challenge, because for this generation of screenagers, it's hard to have sustained attention on something. Like, you pick up a book and the first thing you look at, how long is the book? 12 hours, 15 hours, 25 hours. These are who think it's watching something on a screen for 25 seconds is sustained attention.
One of Meghan's recommended books was 53 hours. Even I have.
Yeah, I think it was the Count of Monte Cristo. But the great thing is, it's what a story. I mean, it just goes on, and somehow it was entirely possible to get through. But yeah, you're right. I mean, look, my book came out in 2019. I suspect that all of the numbers and Jonathan Haidt has written so well about this stuff, about the effect of technology on attention and morale and all kinds of other things. I don't suppose any of it's gotten any better. I do think, and manifestly you can see it, and there's a case study in my book of a family who actually, they volunteered to read aloud every day for 3 months to see what the effect was on their extremely wild children. And the effect was, it was more profound than I could have imagined, and I'm a true believer. It acted like a happiness sedative over the whole household to have this practice of reading aloud. It was just a little respite from the regular hurly-burly of life, but also that kind of bombardment of impulse and image and idea that we get from technology. So baby steps. I don't know that they stayed with it, but this was also a family that had a big screen TV in their living room, and I think they were very much habituated to that way of life. I don't know if they stayed with it. But one thing I did find, there was a wonderful study. I don't know that you want me to go into it now, but I wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal about this in the hopes after the COVID pandemic that people might be interested in finding ways to mitigate learning loss. It does seem that children who are read to, especially struggling children, as we were saying before about children who don't necessarily find it super easy to read, enjoyable. These are 12 and 13-year-olds who were the subjects of the study. When their English teachers stopped the usual process, which might be, let's say, the whole class is going to study a paragraph and we're going to go around the room and everyone has to read a sentence. And so the whole time during class, you're terrified that the teacher's going to call on you next, and you're sweating, and you're not paying any attention to what is being said. When the teachers just threw out all of that practice and they just read aloud exciting stories to these kids, the children just went leaps and bounds on their English tests afterwards. Their sort of tests of competency and reading comprehension and that sort of thing, vocabulary recognition. It's almost like an effortless, I mean, there's a certain amount of effort required, right? You have to make the time. There's the effort of the person who is doing the reading. But then for the people who are the subjects of the reading aloud experience, the children in the room or the teenagers or whatever they are, it is this kind of, a lot of really productive things happen without any apparent effort. It's as though you can't see anything on the outside, but a tremendous amount is happening on the inside. And one of the things that's happening, Mark, to your point, is that the mind is attentive. It's following the words. It's producing images. The different brain domains are connecting and synchronizing. And all of this, well, it certainly seems like a pretty good idea, frankly, and is very helpful in measurable ways.
You gave a list in your really wonderful piece in the journal that Mark mentioned at the outset. And I mentioned the 53 hours of the Count of Monte Cristo, but you're very heavy into, except for a brief veer into Alex Michaelides and The Silent Patient, you're very much into the first half of the 20th century and before. And it was interesting to me why you picked the books you picked. And, The Count of Monte Cristo was one of them. But of course, you mentioned Homer's Iliad. You mentioned the Odyssey, which is certainly not in the time period I mentioned. Henry James, The Wings of a Dove, The Golden Bull, and more. What made you pick those examples?
So I was thinking about actually the epic drives and traffic jams and things and long walks that people do or are dragged into on holiday. So the brief was audiobooks for summer. Okay, run with it. And I was thinking about books that I like the idea of, I called it a summer of repair in the piece, but it was really more the idea that these long journeys are a wonderful opportunity to tackle something like a 52-hour book that you might, in ordinary life, think I have no capacity for that. I have a 10-minute commute. There's no way, what is the point of that? Why would I even start? We all have books, and they're often classic books. They might be from antiquity, like the Iliad and the Odyssey. They might be much more recent, like Henry James, not so recent, obviously. But they're books that we feel that we ought to read, or we really wish we had read. I mean, almost everyone has some little lacuna of that kind. My husband remembers years ago, Salman Rushdie was asked on British television what was the book that he was supposed to have read that he hadn't read. And he confessed to never having read Middlemarch by George Eliot. So if Salman Rushdie hasn't read Middlemarch, then probably all of us have great books that we wish we had read and hadn't read. So this was my idea, to think about those books. I mean, I obviously have been on something of a mission of this sort myself. I really enjoy classic literature. I really enjoy a good meaty story. I like to be acquainted with the different kind of styles of the times and that sort of thing. And so it seemed to me a good idea to talk about those books. And also with the point that we were making earlier about how a book that might be impossible to tackle or just too daunting somehow. I tried to read The Last of the Mohicans not too long ago, and I just couldn't. I couldn't get past the landscape description at the beginning. I just couldn't do it. I just thought, I can't break this up. Now, I do plan to try it on Audible because I'm sure it's a fantastic story. I mean, I know I saw the film. I know it's a fantastic story.
I'm sorry, Daniel Day-Lewis is not in the book, so I'm not sure that.
But he's a hottie, right?
Yes, Daniel Day-Lewis looked great in the movie. I know it made me want to read the book.
So anyway, so this was my idea that yeah, Alex Michaelides, you're right. The Silent Patient, fantastic audiobook, full of surprises, gasp-worthy, and all of that. But I think, for sort of, that's a kind of quick pleasure read in a way. And I suppose I think that long, lazy summer days are a great opportunity to explore things of greater depth, language-wise, plot-wise. And yeah, so anyway, that was the idea I had.
Family car trips are also such a great way to expose your children to books. You have obviously written an entire book about sitting and reading to your children, but it's a great way to read to your children in the car. Two of my kids are hockey players, and I was thinking the other day how many miles I drove with them because I put two Honda Odysseys and drove them into the ground. 100.
Wow, I've only done that with one.
I did
That's
two
a
of them,
lot.
and they each had
Wow.
they had like 180,000 miles on them each. So that's a lot of
Congratulations.
miles. And we would
So
drive.
my father would have said, "You have joined the Iron Butt Society."
I definitely joined the Iron Butt Society. We would drive up to Canada every summer because they would train up there, and so we'd take the whole family and make it a family trip. And we read the entire Chronicles of Narnia, and we actually did it. There's a wonderful, I believe it's Insight for Living. Dr. James Dobson has a dramatized versions of them, which are just wonderful. And I actually asked my daughter this morning what books she remembered from our trips, and that was the first one she mentioned, the whole Chronicles of Narnia. They couldn't wait to get into the car. So we could read. We'd pull into the parking lot and they'd say, "Wait, wait, wait!" They didn't want to get out of the car. They were so
Yes, yes.
wonderful.
Okay, if I may just revert
Yeah.
for just quickly to one moment. I was telling you about this study where teachers threw out, this was actually, the study was conducted in England, where teachers just threw out their normal lesson plans and just read to the kids. The children in this case were, as I said, 12 and 13-year-olds. They were sort of average to poor students who'd never really had any enjoyment out of reading. And this is the thing that the teachers said, is they felt genuine joy teaching these classes because they had children running in. They couldn't wait to hear what is going to happen next. That's a great, that's really the hallmark of a great story, I think. What's going to happen next? There has to be a sense of excitement about it. And yeah, anyway, well, that's wonderful. So what else did you listen to on those journeys?
So the way this all started is when they were younger, we would read, we would get Bill Bennett's Book of Virtues at night.
Oh,
And
yes.
every night we would read one story or one poem or like that, and then just talk about it. And so I used obviously the reading to teach them about, I'm a Catholic, so I was trying to teach them about faith. So there was that. We also listened to this wonderful Chuck Swindoll. There's this wonderful series called Paws and Tales, which is sort of this old-fashioned radio theater for children. And so we'd listen to those. But then I wanted to teach them also about tyranny, because my family came from Eastern Europe and I wanted them to understand communism and fascism and all the rest. So we read Animal Farm together, which they absolutely loved, and a wonderful book by a Jewish author whose name is escaping me right now, but it's called Anna and the Swallow Man.
Oh, I know that book.
Gabriel Savit.
Gabriel Savit. Yeah.
Yes.
Yep. I reviewed that way back when. Yeah.
And it was wonderful. It was about this 7-year-old girl whose father was taken away by the Gestapo, and she's basically left alone in Krakow as a 7-year-old, and she's given over to a family to take care of her, and they abandon her. And she ends up meeting a man she calls the Swallow Man and living in the woods for 4 years to avoid the Holocaust and the Nazis. And my kids just were absolutely riveted by it. So
That has the most chilling scene. Do you remember there's a scene where, I think they're discovered in the woods and there's by some sort of very rough fellow. And she's now old enough, to be of interest to a rough fellow. Oh, gosh.
yes.
It's just got goosebumps, actually, when you reminded me of that. Anyway, everything's fine, and it's safe for children to listen to.
Yes, absolutely. And I just looked him up because in thinking about this, and he has a new book out called The Way Back, which I haven't read yet. So I just downloaded that.
Oh, there was a film made called The Way Back, which was based on a book which you might like, actually, Slavomir Rowitz's book, The Long Walk. It's called The Long Walk. And yeah, anyway, that's a fantastic story about people a small group of people who, Poles mostly, who break out of a gulag and walk across Asia down.
Oh, that sounds wonderful.
India.
I will add it
Yeah.
to my list.
Okay, so I think we've established that A, we all love books.
Yeah.
B, we actually all enjoy listening to books, although with some differences among us. And so what I am curious about, if I can survey both of you. Now, Meghan, you obviously wrote first an entire book about the virtues of reading out loud, and second, this article that brought us to you specifically about what books people should read, and we'll link that in the transcript here. But what is one book that you really wish that you had read that you're going to plan to listen
I'm
to?
so ill prepared to answer this question.
It's a hard one because
It is a hard one.
But we all have that book where we nod because, of course, we should have read it. At AEI, it's always, something Adam Smith, Friedrich Hayek, and I.
The Wealth of Nations. You know what? That's exactly what I want to listen to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Actually, I can say with legitimacy, I've been trying for a couple of years to make my way all the way through Dante's Inferno, or through the Divine
wow.
Comedy. I've made it through the Inferno twice. I've made it through Purgatory twice. But as my daughter says,
you.
it's hard to get into heaven, and I'm telling you, it's hard to get into heaven. So I'm on the moon right now with Dante, and Virgil's left behind because he can't go that far. He's with Beatrice now, and I think I would like to listen to the Divine Comedy on Audible. That's what I would like to listen to, and I think what would be prudent for me is to listen to the same translation that I'm reading, and then maybe I would make it all the way to Seventh Heaven, which I assume is the desired location to get to.
Okay, you, Mark.
I'm scrolling through my Audible of books that I have downloaded in order to read and have not read. And I've come to the and Fred Kagan will love me for this, but of the Donald Kagan's Peloponnesian War. Because I read an article about it recently, and I thought I should never read that. I should read that. So that's one that's on my list.
What about you, Dan?
Mine, very thematically appropriate. So Mark knows I'm sitting here in Florence, which is the birthplace of Dante. And Dante is, of course, the progenitor of the modern Italian language because he was the person who wrote the first book in what was called the lingua vulgare, the vulgar language of Italian, which is what we all speak here now, even more vulgarly. So, funnily enough, I realized listening to you, I should listen to the Divine Comedy, but actually what I want to read again, and I keep starting every summer to read it again, thinking this is appropriate, I keep this book here in Florence, is The Prince.
Since we're on the Dante subject, let me just say, or the Florence and whatever. So it was actually Dante who identified kind of why the miracle of reading aloud works so well, why it is in fact a miracle. And that is because he understood that written language is, which we all know, written language is something you have to learn. You have to learn to read and write, and it takes years, and not everybody gets it. Whereas spoken language, our brains make sense of spoken language instantly. That's how we learn to speak. We know even dogs can understand some words in language. So for us, it's very natural. So if someone is reading to us, the language may be orderly because it's literary, but it goes into our heads with a great deal more ease. Also because our vocabularies are, that is, I think the term is receptive vocabulary. That is to say the words that we understand but couldn't necessarily define or wouldn't necessarily use on our own. We have this vast, supply of words in our heads that make sense to us when we hear them read aloud. Because, as Dante said, we're getting language in the state that we are naturally designed to take it in. So, props to Dante. He was way ahead of us.
Other than the books that you should read and haven't, what's on your list for this summer? What have you chosen to read?
I'm up here in Maine in the town of Rockport, and there's a wonderful little bookstore here called the Barn Swallow Bookstore. And I go in occasionally and just, it's got a very eclectic collection, some new, sometimes some old books in there, just all kinds of mixtures. And I've just picked up a book. Actually, I don't know if I'm going to enjoy it or not, but it's a book called Harriet Said by Beryl Bainbridge. This is on my to-do or my to-read pile. And it was her debut novel. And it's quite a sinister story, I think, about two pubescent girls who seduce and maybe destroy a middle-aged man. But for me, when I saw it, I thought, I must read this, because when I was in the 6th grade, somehow I had this book. I don't know where it came from. I must have taken it out of the school library. I was kind of a big reader at that age and kind of an uncomprehending, not very choosy reader. I'd read everything. And the principal of my middle school saw the book in my hand and plucked it out of my hand and said, "Where did you get this? This is not appropriate for you." And I didn't know. And I really don't remember anything more about the incident than that, but I did remember the name of the book. So that is on my list. Why is it that my 6th grade principal in Cherry Plain, New York, where I was briefly living, why would he have plucked that book out of my hands? Soon I will be able to tell you. Probably it's because it's about pubescent girls torturing a man. Pretty good argument for discouraging me. But anyway, so that's what's on my list.
How about you, Danny?
My list for this summer? I'm really interested to read Amor Towles' short stories for exactly the reason that I talked about. They were panned. His first 3 books were amazing. Amazing. They were so well written. They were so evocative. They were so great. And his book of short stories that came out, I guess, earlier this year, maybe late last year, has been just panned. And I can't believe someone so great could have done a bad job.
He's the most beautiful writer I've ever, I mean, I'm a writer myself, though not of literature. So I recognize the craft. And there's few people who I read and I just say, I wish I could write like that. And that's him. I wish I could write like him.
Think about the demands of the market. So it's often the case, is it not, when an author has broken through, which is so difficult. I mean, there are many wonderful people writing. The author breaks through, the world acclaims the first book, then the second book, then the third book. And then the publisher says, what else have you got for me? And the author thinks, I've got some juvenilia. I've got a few short stories. We'll take those. So, there could be some, I mean, I'm speculating wildly here. I have no idea. Maybe he wrote them fresh and he's just lost his touch. Even Homer nods, right? Even the greatest craftsmen sometimes make a mistake. So maybe it was that, and maybe it was just pressure too.
I think Bad Amor Towles is probably better than a lot of other people.
Yeah.
But you know what? I've hesitated to read it for a different reason. So I tend to fall in love with an author and try and read everything they've ever written. So this happened to me in the 90s with Milan Kundera, where I read The Unbearable Lightness of Being, which of course had become a movie. And then it was so beautiful that I read every book that Kundera had written. And I got to the point where there was no more Kundera to read. And I was so depressed by it. And so what I did the same thing with Amor Towles, where I read A Gentleman in Moscow, then I grabbed Rules of Civility, then I read The Lincoln Highway, which I loved more than Danny did. And he also had a few short stories that he had done as well, which were actually more modern. But then there was nothing left. And so now I have unread Amor Towles out there, and I'm hesitant to read it because there will be a world without unread Amor Towles in it.
Well, maybe you just have to wait a little while. I had the summer of Kazuo Ishiguro some years ago, and I read absolutely everything. I read literally everything he'd written, but he hadn't yet written Never Let Me Go or Clara and the Sun or The Buried Giant. So, some of these guys keep going, and I think Towles will. He's a young guy, I think, isn't he?
I think so, relatively, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know, Mark, you can read Abraham Verghese. Have you read him?
No, have not.
Ooh, how about you, Meghan?
No, I have not.
So his most recent book is called The Covenant of Water, and his previous book was called Cutting for Stone.
Oh, yes.
Right. Cutting for Stone was a wonderful book, absolutely wonderful, about Indian doctors and nurses working in Ethiopia, Italian-occupied Ethiopia in the 1930s. It's fantastic. Mark, you would love it. Meghan, you would love it. And that's
It's going on the list right
there you go. Anyway, we've digressed to basically an enjoyable conversation between the three of us. But thank you. Thank you for underscoring to everybody that there are lots of ways to get the pleasure of reading, that there are lots of ways to share the pleasure of reading with your children, and that there are lots of things you can listen to, both enlightened and completely, as you recommend, Winnie the Pooh.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. Very funny, really good. Mark, actually, I would say some of the readings of the children's, my favorite ones, they're so good that you can listen to them as an adult and then just get almost as much pleasure as if you have chortling children in the back seat.
That's wonderful.
I think C.S. Lewis said something like that, didn't he? That any book written for children that can't be enjoyed by adults must be a terrible book or something. I'm badly mangling that phrase, but
No, but that's totally right. I love going back and reading things that I liked when I was little. Well, except for Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. That
I
doesn't
just
stand
reread that.
the
It's
time.
actually, yeah. No.
You thought it was okay?
There were certain things about it I had forgotten, or I very much noticed what had stood out to me as a child about it. I was much more aware of how much money everyone had in it. I was raised without any money, so it was very noticeable to me that Margaret had a grandmother who said, I'd like to redo your bedroom for you. And the idea, that was just completely unthinkable for me that anyone in my family would. It was pretty touch and go there for a while in my childhood. Certainly no fresh draperies. The other thing about that book, which was sort of striking, is that religion is actually, it's suffused with religion. Religion is just part of everyone's life in the story. What was it, 1971, I think, it came out. So
Something like that.
yeah, I think it was 71. So it's just natural. On Sunday, the Christians go to church and the Jews go to synagogue. And that's, very different from the setting of novels for children that age published today. Religion is not something depicted as anything that people would do or believe in.
That's why we need to read them the old books.
Yes, correct.
pass on the
That old-time
I hate to
religion.
say it, the patrimony.
Yeah. Oh, no, do it. Otherwise,
And
we'll
the
be
matrimony.
hysterical.
Well, happy reading, everybody.
Yeah,
This was
thank
wonderful.
you so much.
Thank
It
you,
was
Meghan.
talking to you guys.
Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at @dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.